Hi, welcome back. Today we have Danno Ferrin from EOF. Please take it away.
Cool. Yep. Happy to be here. Happy to deliver the State of Ethereum state address. I hope you like talking about state because I'm going to be stating the state. I'm going to be restating the state, and I'm going to tell you about the estate of the state. The state is probably one of the biggest talking points and concerns about Ethereum over the past few years. But you know, what is this concern with the state? First, a little bit about myself, though. I'm from Team Epsilon, which is one of the teams at the Ethereum Foundation. I just started there in January. I've been a long-time contributor to Ethereum. I have been to every single ETHDenver, including the one they did online in the pandemic. So I love this place. I think this place is great. So first, we need to talk about what the state is. What is the state that we're worried about in Ethereum? And it turns out it's the data we use, and a lot of data about the data we use. And that's really where the problem comes in, is a lot of the data about the data and a lot of the history. So we're going to talk about the chain data and how we bring that data onto your device. Now this eye-popping chart, yes, it's going up to the right. This is probably what we want, but this is not what we want going up and to the right. And that is the size of how much data you need to store an archive version of an Ethereum node. 21 terabytes tracks the total size of everything related to the Ethereum node in the past nearly 10 years that it's been running. Very few people have 21 terabytes on their Ethereum node. This is tracking literally every piece of metadata about it that could possibly be calculated and needed. Now this is a probably more realistic chart. This chart is showing what a full Ethereum node is tracking. You'll notice that the black line on the bottom is parity. Parity stopped working at the time of the merge. It's a fairly flat growth. And the blue line is Geth. Geth had some pruning issues with some of the data that it was keeping that it didn't. But eventually last year it figured it out, and now it's a nice slow growth line up and to the right. And you see right now it's about 1.25 gigabytes of data. Still a lot of data, 1.2 terabytes actually. Terabytes of data. Terabytes was the right word. 1,000 gigabytes, and that's not necessarily a good thing. So why do we need all this data? What is all of this data, and what is it all about? So if you think about the things that you use in Ethereum, your account, your balance, a particular state value that you need, think of those as a number with a path to a location of where it stays. I am this number in this account, and I represent 25, and I live here. These things we call leaves, and they live at the bottom of a tree. So we take all these leaves, we arrange them in a tree, you put them in the bottom of the tree, and we can't just transfer however many gigabytes of data to say this is the current state. We need to reduce it to a smaller number. So we do something called a Merkle tree. We hash this value together as we go up in levels. So the first level will hash the lowest level of trees, the lowest level of leaves, and we'll get a branch value that represents that. There's fewer of those. When we go up the next level, there might be a leaf in addition to some of those branches. We wind up with fewer values. And we keep going up, and we keep hashing these branches together using a hash function until finally we get one number that represents the state of the Ethereum network. That is a number with 256 bits in it. It's got about, I don't know, a whole bunch of zeros. It's a really large number, and it's unlikely that you're going to find the same number twice, which is what makes it a good number. And they use a very secure hash number that when you do the math, it's going to be really hard to reproduce with anything that is even remotely the same. So this is what we do when we calculate the hash, when we pass the block headers around, we reduce it to one single number. So how could one single number result in so much data? It's because when we change the data, we also need to change all the branches above it. So in this case, if we change two leaves values, we then need to recalculate all the branches above it and the root node, which isn't that bad if you do it once. And if you're a full node, you just keep what you need that's relatively current. But if you're an archive node, you need to copy that data to the side. And those same two values change again, you have to store it again, and again, and again, and again, and again. So you got this big giant pile of tree branches of every time in the history that this value has ever changed and all the metadata around what the actual root node of it is. So archive nodes track every single one of these values throughout the entire history of Ethereum, whereas a full node just keeps a relatively short list of maybe the past few days. So this is a lot of data. And the next question is, well, how do we synchronize this data? There's principally four methods. The first one isn't really used that much. It's where each of the client goes around and they take that root node, that value, and they ask all the other clients, hey, tell me the children. And then they get that branch value and they go, hey, tell me the children of that. And they start at the bottom of the tree and they go all the way down to the bottom of the tree. So they go from top to bottom syncing it. And this works great in small numbers, but when you get to a real full production size mainnet experience, this can take days to calculate. And the problem is that clients like to clean up and keep things nice and tidy, so that root node that you thought you had around, there's going to be less and less clients that are going to be able to share that information. So the problem is when you do this fast sync, and it was faster than some of the alternatives, is you're eventually going to run out of references to that root node, and no one's going to be able to tell you what your tree leaves are. So a number of years ago, Geth came up with a better idea called fast sync, and Besu and Nethermind also implemented it. And the difference is you start with the leaves at the bottom. You just say, hey, just tell me the leaves are. Give me the first 10. Okay, give me the next 10. And you keep moving left to right across the tree. And as time progresses, you just say, give me the current value of that. So as you go left to right, you don't have the leaves at the same point in time. You have them over an increasing point in time, but eventually you have all of them. And once you think you have all of them, you add them up, you do the hash, you get a root value, and spoiler alert, it's going to be wrong, but that's okay. Because that's when you start the next step, which is the healing step. You basically do a fast sync from this top, and you start asking for that number, and you ask for the branches below and below, and eventually, you're going to find an entire series of branches that you already have. It's going to save you a bunch of time. You don't sync that. Surprisingly, small amounts of the database actually change over the number of hours it takes to sync it. So this goes relatively quick. Another important step while fast sync and full sync are going on is while you're downloading these branch datas, you're also downloading the entire block header and the block history of Ethereum. The list of all the transactions that anyone has ever executed is being downloaded in parallel to this tree data. And that's very important to realize. The tree data and the transaction lists are two separate items. We'll come up to a chart on that later. Now, TreeDBs are not the only way to store this data. Aragon has its own style of database that Reth is duplicating. So they can't do this fast sync. Instead, they got to do a different kind of synchronization, which is basically got to replay from the beginning. And that can take a long time if you calculate all the branches of every single block. So Reth and Aragon optimize it, and they don't calculate those values. They just download the values, run everything to the end, and at that point, they calculate the root node. And if you do everything right, the number is going to be just fine because it's tracking and making sure that you've been doing everything correctly. And again, at the same time that it's running this, it's got to first download all the blocks. And it tends to, the block download tends to go faster than the actual execution. There's one way that nobody really does anymore, and it's basically a variant of a database copy. Parity used to do this. They take their current database, they dump it out to a file, and then everyone would download that file and extract that out into their clients. It worked great until the blockchain got too big, and it got to the point where the amount of time it took to export this data was longer than the amount of time they had to export it before they had to reseed it again and get started again. So that sort of a database snapshot technique really isn't used before. So once you run all this data, once you synchronize all this data, what are we looking at in the blockchain? Well, if you have an archive node, the archive branch data takes about 20 times as much data as the rest of the chain. That little slim circle in the middle, that's the current full node data, and all that green circle around it, that's an archive node. So when you look down deeper, and what you really get is you get quite a different story. The actual data that represents what you're calculating, the account state, the storage state, and your code, takes up only 5% of the data. 15% of the data is that metadata of the tree that holds it up. So 80% of the data is literally just the list of all the transactions that Ethereum has had for the entire history of Ethereum. If you're following the rules. If you're not following the rules, you can chop it off. But the rules right now say that you're supposed to download every single transaction for the whole history of Ethereum. And that's why the blockchain keeps growing. That's why people freak out when you say, when you increase the gas limit, we're not going to be able to handle the data. The data is not the data on-chain that you're using at the moment. The data is the entire historical ledger of Ethereum that we have to download if we increase the block size. Now, why would we want to increase the block size, and what are some of the things that have been done to deal with this? So in that, we start talking about layer 2s and blobs, because a lot of the use in Ethereum in the past couple of years has really exploded on layer 2s. And layer 2s have a voracious appetite for transaction history. Here is a graph of the number of user operations since the dawn of L2s. For a long time, there was less transactions that were on mainnet, and then there was a bit where it crossed over, and then over the past 2 years, it's just absolutely exploded, and it's just gone bonkers. Now, one thing to pay attention to, that last little green diamond there on the right, that is when Denkun activated, and where the most important thing to happen into the L2 ecosystem happened, blobs were activated. And you can see that there's an immediate tripling of the amount of user transactions that were done in that time because everything became that much cheaper and everyone were just excited to start using it again. And it fell off, but then it's come back with a vengeance. You can see that it is 16 times as many transactions happen on layer 2 than happen on layer 1. This, in some ways, is the absolute fulfillment of the rollup-centric roadmap. We're doing more things not on the main chain, but on layer 2 chains. And what's interesting is when you look at that growth, the gas limit for Ethereum has really remained static for the past 2 years. On average, there's 15 million gas executed per block. It can go up and down. There's some floating fee market stuff that goes on with it. But on average, it's going to be 15 million per block. And for over 2 years, since the merge, we haven't touched it till about a month ago. And last month, we updated it to be about 18 million gas per block. So that little blue bar at the very end of that is the same. So the gas has been flat. But you want to talk about the gas? Let's look at the size of the average block over that time. It tells an entirely different story. 2 years ago, it started out at a reasonable level, and it kept going up, up, and up. The reason is because layer 2s had to store all of their layer 2 transaction data on the layer 1 blockchain as call data. They had to put all their data in the transaction to be a real layer 2 to have the layer 1 track all of their data. So you can see that the values went up, up, and up, and it peaked at about a quarter megabyte of data in January. And then you'll notice that there about March, it absolutely went down like a rocket slide and went back down to more reasonable levels that we've seen in the past. And this is when Cancun activated, when all the layer 2s stopped posting to layer 1 and started posting to blobs. Blobs are a different kind of data. They're just random data that is associated with a particular transaction that we don't have to keep around as part of the main history. Blobs have to be kept for 14 days on the consensus client, and then the consensus client can keep them or dispose of them as they see fit. They're only responsible for retrieving them for 14 days. And when we target 3 blobs per block on average, what that means is you need to take about 36 gigabytes of data on your consensus client to store these blobs. So that means we're transacting in nearly a terabyte of data in blob data. And then that's for Cancun. In about a month or two, we're going to fork Pectra, and we're going to double that number to 6 blobs per block is what our target's going to be. And what that means is that you need to keep 73 gigabytes of data on your hard drive, and it's going to be nearly 2 terabytes of data per year of blob data that's going to be processed. But remember, your consensus client only has to keep that 73 gigabytes of data. We don't have to keep the entire history of every blob. That's the layer 2's job to do that, and we put markers and hashes in the blockchain so they can prove that their blob did exist at that point. Some really fancy KZG moon math. Now in Fusaka, ideally we're going to launch it this year in the Q3. There's a couple of ideas of what we're going to do. One idea, the very simple solution that we know we can achieve, is just to go up another 3 blocks, target 9 blocks. And that means we can have about 120 gigabytes of data. It takes about 3 terabytes of data. The more exciting answer, though, is something called peered as. And if we do peered as, we can go for a 6x, 8x number, 48 blobs. Now, in some of this math, you'll notice it looks like I'm doing it for 96 blobs, but that's because they do some erasure data, some magical moon math to make sure that it works right, so that you only have to store about 200 gigabytes of data on your block, even though we've gone 8x on it, it only doubles. And so this provides an average throughput of 30 terabytes per year of blob data that can be stored on the layer 2 blockchain. So what is peered as? That's a 20-minute talk in and of itself. But I think this picture really gives you an idea of what it is. Each client only keeps a subset of the blocks, and the subset that they're responsible for keeping, they have a little sub-network of other peers that they talk to, that they can get the data and share amongst themselves, so that you know who you're sharing it with, and you can make sure that each other is keeping, you can challenge it, and you can get different pieces for it. And they use advanced erasure encoder mechanisms. Now, one of the things to note that this is not the final evolution of blobs on Ethereum. This is step 2. The third step, full dank sharding, these columns, they become simple squares. So it's 2-dimensional, and the number that I've heard thrown around, I don't know if they're going to be able to achieve this, but this is the goal they're going for, 256 blobs per block. That's a lot of data. I didn't even do the math for that. I mean, I might need more than terabytes to track that. So what this comes down to on a consensus client is you only need right now 95 gigabytes of data to run a consensus client on your node. The blobs cycle through every 14 days. The finalized slots, not quite as rigorous at the 14 days, but they don't have to keep all of it. So the size of the finalized block stays pretty constant. It's not going to grow like it does with the block history. So what they've done in consensus is they've got a very consistent target that this is what you're going to have to keep. And it's going to be fairly static. It's fairly predictable. We know what it's going to be. It's not going to grow without bound because we can prune the data. So consensus layer really has its act together. What can the execution layer learn from what the consensus layer has done? And that's going to come up in EIP 4444. Now, blobs had its own number, 4844. And I guess they like fours so much that they went with 4444, 4 fours, to truly emphasize this next. It sounds complex, but it's a really simple solution to what the execution clients are going to do to maintain their state. They're just not going to keep it. These 2 bullet points is basically what the entire specification of EIP 4444 is. If the data is more than a year old, you should not serve it. And if you're not serving it, you may prune it. If you're not going to tell anyone about a transaction back in 2019, you don't have to keep it around. So whenever you do a peer-to-peer query, if you ask for something older than a year, no one's going to give it to you. If you ask for a block, a RPC for something that is, back in 2022, the RPC is not going to do that for you. Now, you can if you want. It's only a should. If you deliberately do it, you can do it. But no one can make you, and no one can punish you, and no one can blacklist you as a node if you refuse to serve stuff older than a year. That's what 444 allows. And what happens if you take all that more than a year old data and you prune it away? You throw away just basically a terabyte of data that you no longer need to keep on your client. It takes the amount of data that you need to do, and it cuts it by over 2/3. So what used to take 1.5 terabytes now takes 0.5 terabyte. And what's amazing is if we don't do anything with the block gas, which we will, but if we kept block gas at the same level, those numbers would stay relatively consistent. The only real growth we would get is in new accounts, new balances, new tokens, and those grow at a much smaller rate than just the raw transactional history. So it still has a possibility to grow without bound if everyone uses the blockchain without bound and we have to keep all the data. There's a plan for state expiry that probably going to have to deal with in a couple of years. But as we can see, it's still the smaller portion. The tree branches to track that data is bigger. And the amount of your blockchain history is, it's not even as big as the rest of the data now. It's a really great solution. It's really subtle, and it has powerful impacts. But what about all that data? Does it just go away? Does it go in the bit bucket? How do we get the entire history of transaction of Ethereum? It's kind of important stuff. Oh, before I get to that though, when are we going to pull the pin on this? We're going to pull the pin on this feature, not as part of a fork, because it doesn't require a hard fork. We're just going to do it on an agreed upon day. And the day that the clients agreed on in the execution layer is May 1st. Mayday, mayday, mayday. We're going to get rid of 2/3 of the data, and it's going to be awesome. Unless you need that data, so you need to download it and sync it quick. Actually, we got a better solution to that. Another thing that deserves its own 20-minute talk is something that Piper Marion's been working on called the Portal Network. The Portal Network is going to keep all of this history for you in a separate peer-to-peer network with separate cryptographic incentives, and it's going to make sure that this data is still available. And it stores more than just the block history. It's going to store the state history, it's going to broadcast transactions, and it's designed actually to support light client execution, real light client execution, the sort of stuff that we are looking for witnesses, except you're not going to need witnesses. So if you access the Portal Network, you can actually execute some of your transactions without having to download an entire blockchain. There's a whole raft of clients and everything that you can look up if you go to their site, ethportal.net. But like I said, it's an entire 20-minute talk in its own right. So I'm here to tell you that the state of the Ethereum state is strong. It's been a very powerful changing force in the world, and it's not going to hold us back. We're still going to be able to remember all that we had. We're going to be able to maintain and take care of the state that we need in the future. We'll be able to grow responsibly. With these changes that we're doing in EIP 444 and 4844 with blobs, and with restricting the size of the blockchain, we can increase block space, we can increase gas limits, and we can make sure that our clients will not run out of disk space unpredictably. We'll be able to make sure that everyone can serve the state, can make use of the state, and can prosper from what the state provides. I mean the Ethereum state, not the government state. They're kind of the opposite level on that. But again, the state is good.
Yeah. Thank you, Danno. Appreciate your talk. It's very informative. Okay, so we're taking a short break. Thank you guys